Once upon a time, in a lively little village surrounded by golden fields and flowing rivers, there lived a man named Hakeem. He was famous for his unusual way of thinking. Sometimes people thought he was the wisest man in the world, and at other times they thought he was the biggest fool to ever walk the earth. Despite his odd ways, everyone in the village loved Hakeem. He had a kind heart, a great sense of humor, and a knack for getting out of tricky situations in the strangest ways. His adventures became legendary, and children would sit around him in the marketplace waiting to hear his stories. One day, something very interesting happened. Hakeem took his old donkey to the market to sell. The donkey was stubborn, slow, and had a habit of stopping in the middle of the road for no reason. Hakeem knew that selling it wouldn't be easy. When he arrived at the market, he tied the donkey to a post and shouted, "Come, come. The strongest and smartest donkey in the world is for sale." The villagers gathered around, eyeing the donkey suspiciously. One man said, "This donkey looks old and lazy. Why should I buy it?" Hakeem smiled and said, "Because this donkey is so wise that it stops and thinks deeply before taking every step." Another man asked, "Why does it look so tired?" Hakeem replied, "Because it spends all night guarding my house from thieves." A third man laughed. "If it's so valuable, why are you selling it?" Hakeem sighed dramatically. "Because," he said, "I am simply too foolish to own such a smart donkey. It deserves a wiser master." A wealthy merchant, amused by Hakeem's words, bought the donkey for a high price. But as soon as he took the reins, the donkey sat down and refused to move. The merchant turned to Hakeem. "You tricked me. This donkey is as stubborn as a rock." Hakeem shrugged. "Didn't I tell you it was wise? It is now thinking if it wants to go with you or not." The crowd roared with laughter, and the merchant, realizing he had been outwitted, shook his head and chuckled. One day, the king of the land heard about Hakeem's cleverness and foolishness. Curious, he sent for him. When Hakeem arrived at the palace, the king said, "If you are as wise as people say, then solve this riddle. What is something that belongs to you but is used by others more than by you?" Hakeem thought for a moment, then grinned. "That is easy, your majesty. The answer is my name." The king laughed and clapped his hands. "Very good, but I have another challenge for you." He handed Hakeem a jar filled to the top with water. "You must add something to this jar without spilling a single drop of water. If you fail, I will punish you. If you succeed, I will reward you." The crowd fell silent, expecting Hakeem to fail. But Hakeem simply picked up a handful of salt and dropped it into the jar. The salt dissolved, and not a single drop of water spilled. The king was amazed. "You have great wisdom, Hakeem. You have won my challenge." Hakeem smiled. "Your Majesty, wisdom is like salt. It disappears, but it makes everything better." From that day on, the king often invited Hakeem to the palace to hear his wise and foolish words. One evening, Hakeem was invited to a grand feast at a nobleman's house. He arrived wearing his old, torn clothes, but when he stepped inside, no one greeted him. The guests ignored him, and the servants refused to serve him food. Hakeem understood what was happening. He left quietly, went home, and put on his finest robe, an elegant silk garment with golden embroidery. Then he returned to the feast. This time, the host greeted him warmly. "Welcome, dear Hakeem. Please, come and enjoy our meal." Servants rushed to serve him delicious food. Hakeem took a large spoonful of stew and poured it onto his sleeve. Then he picked up some rice and stuffed it into his pocket. The guests stared in shock. "Hakeem, what are you doing?" Hakeem smiled. "Since you are serving me only because of my clothes, then my clothes should eat first." The guests burst into laughter, realizing their mistake. The nobleman apologized, and from that day on, he promised to judge people by their hearts, not their clothes. One night, two thieves decided to steal from Hakeem's house. They crept in quietly, but to their surprise, they found Hakeem sitting on his bed, wide awake. The first thief whispered, "What do we do now?" The second thief replied, "Let's pretend to be his friends and trick him." They stepped forward and said, "Oh, Hakeem, we are travelers who lost our way. Can we stay here for the night?" Hakeem smiled. "Of course, but my house is small. One of you must sleep under the bed, and the other must sleep outside." The thieves agreed, hoping to rob him in the morning. Late at night, Hakeem woke up and shouted, "Help! Thieves are in my house." Then he ran outside, waking the neighbors. The villagers came running. "Where are the thieves?" Hakeem pointed to his house. "One is under my bed, and the other is standing outside." The thieves were caught, and the villagers laughed at how easily they had been tricked. As the years passed, Hakeem continued to amaze, confuse, and entertain the villagers with his cleverness and foolishness. Some called him a genius, while others called him a madman, but everyone agreed on one thing: life was never boring with Hakeem around. The clever rooster. In a quiet village nestled between rolling green hills and a sparkling river, there lived a man named Hakeem. The people of the village were never sure whether Hakeem was the wisest man in the land or the biggest fool they had ever met. One day he would say something so clever that even the village elders would nod in admiration, and the next day he would do something so ridiculous that people would shake their heads and laugh. But despite his strange ways, Hakeem was loved by all. He was kind, cheerful, and always seemed to have a trick up his sleeve. He had no great riches, no grand house, and no fine clothes. But what he did have was a very special rooster. This rooster, named Zaki, was no ordinary bird. He was tall, proud, and covered in glossy, golden-red feathers that shimmered in the sunlight. His beak was sharp, his eyes were keen, and his tail feathers arched like a royal banner in the wind. But most of all, Zaki was clever, so clever that Hakeem often said, "This rooster is smarter than half the people I know." Every morning, before even the first ray of sunlight touched the rooftops, Zaki would crow at the top of his lungs. His voice was so loud that it echoed across the village, bouncing off the walls, waking up farmers, merchants, and even the laziest of sleepers. And that was where the trouble began. Would sleep until noon every day, wrapped in soft pillows, while his servants tiptoed around, afraid to wake him. He believed that waking up early was for fools and farmers, not for someone as important as him. But lately, the Pasha's mornings had been ruined. Every single day, before dawn, the same terrible sound shattered his dreams. Cock-a-doodle-dee-o. The Pasha would jolt awake, his silk pillows tumbling off the bed, his golden nightcap flying across the room. "Who dares to wake me?" he would roar, but no one dared to answer. After a week of this, the Pasha could not take it anymore. He summoned his most trusted guard. "Find out what is making this terrible noise," he ordered. That very afternoon, the guard returned and bowed deeply. "Your Excellency, the sound comes from the rooster of a man named Hakeem." The Pasha's eyes gleamed. "A rooster? A rooster so loud it can wake even me? I must have it." He snapped his fingers. "Go to this Hakeem and take the rooster for me." That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Hakeem sat outside his humble home, sipping a cup of mint tea. Zaki sat beside him on a wooden post, preening his feathers like a noble bird. Suddenly, the ground rumbled. Hakeem looked up to see a group of soldiers marching toward his house. Their armor gleamed, their spears shone, and their leader, a tall man with a thick mustache, stopped in front of Hakeem with a scowl. "Hakeem, the Pasha demands your rooster," the soldier barked. Hakeem took a slow sip of his tea and sighed. "Oh dear, what has my poor rooster done now?" "The Pasha cannot sleep," the soldier snapped. "Your rooster's crowing wakes him every morning, and he is very, very angry. He orders you to hand over the rooster at once." Hakeem glanced at Zaki, who fluffed his feathers and let out a small, defiant cluck. "Oh, but I cannot give you Zaki," Hakeem said, shaking his head. "He is not just a rooster, he is my dearest friend. He keeps me company, wakes me up, and helps me think." The soldiers did not care. The Pasha is not asking, he is taking. With that, they grabbed Zaki, placed him in a golden cage, and marched back toward the palace. Hakeem stroked his beard and watched them go. Then, with a small smile, he whispered, "Don't worry, my friend. I will get you back. At the palace, the Pasha was delighted. A fine-looking rooster indeed, he declared, admiring Zaki in his golden cage. Now I will wake up to the sound of the greatest rooster in the land. That night, the Pasha went to bed dreaming of a peaceful morning. But Zaki had other plans. As soon as the palace fell silent, Zaki began working. He pecked and pecked at the lock of the golden cage. He twisted his beak this way and that, nudging the latch. After an hour of hard work, click, the lock popped open. Zaki fluttered out of the cage, hopped onto the windowsill, and with a mighty flap of his wings, he flew into the night, heading straight for Hakeem's house. By sunrise, the entire village awoke to the familiar sound cock-a-doodle-dee-o. The Pasha nearly fell out of his bed. What? How he bellowed, throwing off his silk covers. He rushed outside, still wearing his golden nightcap, only to see his precious rooster sitting on Hakeem's roof, looking as smug as ever. The villagers roared with laughter. The Pasha stormed to Hakeem's house, his face red with fury. Hakeem, you stole my rooster. Hakeem smiled. Your rooster? But didn't you take him from me first? If he has returned, perhaps he does not belong to you. The Pasha clenched his fists. Fine. Then I shall buy him. How much? Hakeem stroked his beard. Ah, but a smart rooster like Zaki? He is worth at least 100 gold coins. The Pasha's eye twitched, but he wanted the rooster. Grumbling, he handed over the gold. Hakeem waved politely. That night, Zaki escaped again and returned home. The next morning, as the rooster's crow shattered the silence once more, the Pasha stormed back to Hakeem. Give me back my money, he roared. Hakeem shrugged. Oh, but your highness, I did not sell you the rooster. I only sold you the chance to own him. The Pasha was speechless. He had been outwitted by a fool and a bird. From that day on, the Pasha never dared to take anything from Hakeem again. And Hakeem? Well, he spent his 100 gold coins wisely on seeds and treats for Zaki. Once upon a time, in a lively village surrounded by golden wheat fields and rolling hills, there lived a man named Hakeem. Some called him wise, others called him a fool, but everyone agreed on one thing. Life was never boring when Hakeem was around. Hakeem lived simply. His house was small, his clothes were plain, and his only true possession of value was his wits. He never worried about wealth, for he believed that luck and wisdom were worth more than gold. But one day, luck came knocking at his door, in the form of a mysterious bag of gold. One early morning, as the sun stretched its golden fingers over the village, Hakeem was walking along a dusty road, humming a cheerful tune. The birds sang in the trees, the breeze was cool, and all seemed right with the world. Suddenly, his foot hit something hard. He looked down and gasped. There, half buried in the dirt, was a large leather bag, heavy and bulging. Hakeem bent down, pulled it from the ground, and untied the string. Inside, glimmering in the morning sunlight, were gold coins. His eyes widened. Well, either I've become rich, or this is the heaviest bag of potatoes I've ever found. He looked around. The road was empty. There was no sign of anyone who might have dropped it. Now, a fool might have run home with the treasure, and a greedy man might have hidden it away. But Hakeem was neither. He scratched his beard and said, "This is not my gold. I must find the owner." So, Hakeem took the bag of gold and walked straight to the village marketplace, where merchants, traders, and farmers bustled about, shouting their prices and displaying their goods. At the very center of the marketplace stood Ibrahim the merchant, the wealthiest man in the village. He owned silk, spices, jewels, and camels. His belly was round from feasting, and his fingers were covered in gold rings. When Ibrahim saw Hakeem carrying the bag, his eyes lit up like a candle in the dark. "Ah, my friend Hakeem," he called out, stepping forward. "What a fine morning, is it not?" Hakeem smiled. "Indeed it is, Ibrahim, and it may be even finer for you. I have found a bag of gold. Have you lost anything?" The merchant's greedy mind raced. He had not lost any gold, but he saw an opportunity. Yes, That bag belongs to me, he declared, puffing out his chest. Hakeem raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? Absolutely. I was just thinking this morning, where is my bag of gold? And here you are, returning it to me. What luck. Hakeem crossed his arms. And how much gold was in your bag? Ibrahim hesitated. 100 coins. Hakeem shook his head. Strange, this bag has 200. Ibrahim's face twitched. Of course. My mistake. It had 200 coins. That's exactly how much I lost. Hakeem smiled, but his eyes twinkled with mischief. Then he said, this cannot be your bag. Ibrahim frowned. What? Why not? Because the real owner lost 100 coins. Your bag had 200. This is clearly someone else's. The villagers burst into laughter. Ibrahim's face turned red. No. I meant to say I lost 200. Hakeem shrugged. Too late. You already claimed your bag had 100. This gold must belong to someone else. Ibrahim stomped his foot. Hakeem, you tricked me. Hakeem laughed. No, my friend. Your greed tricked you. The villagers cheered. Furious, Ibrahim marched straight to the village judge, dragging Hakeem with him. The judge, an old and wise man, sat on a grand wooden chair, listening to complaints all day long. He adjusted his spectacles and said, What is the problem now? Ibrahim pointed at Hakeem. This man found my gold and refuses to return it. The judge turned to Hakeem. Is this true? Hakeem shook his head. Not at all, Your Honor. I only wish to return the bag to its rightful owner. But Ibrahim first claimed he lost 100 coins, then changed his story to 200. The judge frowned and turned to Ibrahim. Is this true? Ibrahim gulped. I misspoke. It was just a mistake. The judge sighed. I see. He stroked his beard for a moment, then smiled. I have decided, the judge said. Since Ibrahim himself admitted that he lost 100 coins, and this bag has 200, then this cannot be his gold. Ibrahim gasped. But, the judge raised a hand. And since we do not know the true owner, the gold will stay with Hakeem until the real owner comes forward. Ibrahim's jaw dropped open like a fish. The villagers laughed and cheered. Hakeem bowed. As you wish, Your Honor. Ibrahim stormed home, grumbling about clever fools and lost gold. Meanwhile, Hakeem waited. He knew that if no one came forward to claim the gold, the judge would let him keep it. A week passed. No one claimed the bag. But Hakeem was no greedy man. Instead of spending the money on riches, he used it to help the village. He bought grain for the hungry, repaired broken houses, and even threw a great feast where all were welcome, except for greedy merchants. And the best part? He saved one special gold coin and left it outside Ibrahim's shop with a note. A wise man knows that one coin given with kindness is worth more than 200 taken with greed. When Ibrahim read the note, his face burned with shame. And from that day on, though he never became a generous man, he never tried to cheat Hakeem again. And as for Hakeem, well, he laughed, lived simply, and never stopped outwitting the greedy. In a village nestled between golden wheat fields and towering mountains, there lived a man named Hakeem. Some called him wise, others called him a fool, but one thing was certain. Life around him was always full of surprises. Hakeem owned a single donkey, a stubborn but intelligent creature named Jamal. This donkey was no ordinary beast. He had the patience of a saint, the appetite of a king, and, according to Hakeem, the wisdom of a scholar. One day, Hakeem declared to the village, My donkey is not just a donkey. He is the wisest animal in all the land. The villagers burst into laughter. A donkey? Wise? Cried the blacksmith. Hakeem, you've lost your mind. Hakeem simply smiled. You'll see, he said, patting Jamal's head. But little did the villagers know, Jamal was about to prove them very, very wrong. One fine morning, while the village was still waking up, a royal messenger on horseback galloped into the square, his red cloak billowing behind him. He held up a golden scroll and shouted, "Hear ye, hear ye! A grand competition has been declared by His Majesty, the Sultan." The villagers gathered, murmuring with excitement. "The Sultan seeks the wisest person in the land. The winner shall receive a chest of gold and a place as the Sultan's royal advisor." The people gasped. A royal reward? A chest of gold? This was no small matter. "Anyone may enter," the messenger continued. "But beware, the Sultan's riddles are not easily solved." The villagers buzzed with excitement. The schoolteacher, the village elder, and even the spice merchant all declared themselves worthy competitors. Then, to everyone's shock, Hakeem stepped forward with his donkey. "I shall enter the competition," he announced, "and my donkey shall be my partner." The village exploded with laughter. "Your donkey?" gasped the baker. "Hakeem, do you think the Sultan is looking for the wisest man or the wisest farm animal?" Hakeem only shrugged. Wisdom comes in many forms. And so, to the disbelief of the entire village, Hakeem and Jamal set off toward the Sultan's palace. The Sultan's palace was the grandest building Hakeem had ever seen. Marble pillars stretched high into the sky, fountains danced with sparkling water, and the air smelled of rose petals and fine spices. In the grand hall, the Sultan sat on a throne of gold, surrounded by nobles, scholars, and judges. The Sultan raised an eyebrow when he saw Hakeem and his donkey step forward. "Who are you?" "I am Hakeem," he said with a bow. "And this is my donkey, Jamal, the wisest creature I know." The nobles snickered, but the Sultan leaned forward, intrigued. "Very well. If your donkey is so wise, let us put him to the test." He clapped his hands, and a scribe unrolled a scroll. "The first challenge," announced the Sultan, "is the riddle of the three brothers." The Sultan leaned forward. There were once three brothers, each with a different talent. The first could see the future, the second could heal any wound, and the third could bring the dead back to life. One day, the three brothers found a dying man. The first brother foresaw his death, the second healed his wounds, and the third revived him when he passed away. The Sultan stroked his beard. "Tell me, Hakeem, which of the three brothers was most important?" The audience fell silent. The greatest scholars in the land had debated this riddle for years. Hakeem turned to his donkey. "Well, Jamal," he asked, "what do you think?" The donkey blinked. Then he let out a loud, long bray, HHW. The court erupted in laughter. The Sultan raised a hand for silence. "Is that your answer, Hakeem?" "A donkey's bray." Hakeem nodded. "Yes, your Majesty. My donkey has spoken the truth." The wisest of the three brothers was none of them. Gasps echoed through the hall. The man would have lived only because all three worked together. If even one of them had been missing, he would have died. The Sultan's eyes widened in surprise. He clapped his hands. "Clever. But let us see if your donkey can solve another." The Sultan turned to a servant and whispered something. Moments later, a massive clay jar was brought in. "For your next challenge," said the Sultan, "your donkey must do something that no other donkey has done before." Hakeem nodded. "What is the task?" The Sultan smiled mischievously. "Your donkey must fit inside this jar without breaking it." The crowd roared with laughter. "A donkey? Inside a jar? Impossible." Hakeem stroked his beard thoughtfully. Then he turned to Jamal and whispered, "Let us teach them the true meaning of wisdom." Jamal stared at the jar, flicked his ears, and then he lifted his tail and let out the loudest, longest fart the palace had ever heard. The nobles gasped. Servants covered their noses. The Sultan burst into laughter. "What is the meaning of this?" Hakeem bowed. "Your Majesty, my donkey has done something truly remarkable. He has placed part of himself inside the jar without breaking it." The Sultan wiped away tears of laughter. "Hakeem, you are a madman, but your wisdom is undeniable." At the end of the competition, the Sultan rose from his throne.